You're listening to the Yeshiva of Newark at IDT podcast. I'm your host and curator, Rabbi Avraham Kivlevitz, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Queer the Aisles, the Projectionist has Semicha. Hi, I'm here with Yitzchak Kolakowski. Day after President's Day. We missed it, Yitzchak, on 2/22/22. But that didn't stop you from allowing yourself some presidential previews, some sort of you took a shot at a film that was, I guess, giving people an understanding, a appreciation of a president that was only gone. I think when the movie came out, only the president. It was only a question of about less than 30 years, I guess, since that person was president. But and it's, I actually had not heard about this film, and neither did you. But why don't you start us off here with your? You're not going to call this your presidential pick, are you? It's more like a presidential curiosity, or is this really a pick?
I had heard of the film actually because Glenn Beck writes a lot of books on history, and he likes to do it in a form of storytelling when he brings out the historical stories about all kinds of interesting, heroes and villains of history. And he certainly, to me, one of the most satisfying things to hear in media is to hear Glenn Beck express his deep hatred for Woodrow Wilson. And it's just something curiously satisfying about that. I don't know why it is, and I've certainly been influenced by that. But in one of the books that he wrote, which is an anthology of just stories of heroes and villains of history, he talks about Wilson, and then he talks about this movie, about how it was really played up by 20th Century Fox when they made this movie as this great, brilliant masterpiece to talk about this great, brilliant president, who was, such a visionary and so ahead of his time and such a progressive, but somehow it didn't gain that appreciation in the box office that it was really played up as being this really great, brilliant film that it really wasn't. It wasn't a horrible film. I could say I enjoyed it, even though I'm not a fan of the person that it's about. And I kind of see Wilson as kind of the forerunner of a lot of the issues that have been plaguing us really since his time. He really was a person who I think did tremendous damage to this country, although he did some great things, but I think much of the damage outweighs the positive.
He did become again. He was president. He won the 1912 U.S. presidential election, right? And he was president for 2 terms.
Yeah, his election was really a fluke because Teddy Roosevelt was trying to run for not a direct third term, not an immediate third term, but after being out of the White House to try to get back in, and he really broke up the Republican ticket. Actually, in the movie, they had a picture of. They said it's a simple equation. The elephant divided by the moose equals the donkey. That it was because
right. In other words, Roosevelt was the Bull Moose Party. The elephant was Taft, and once you had the Bull Moose, which was Teddy took all the votes away from the incumbent, which allowed this intellectual governor of New Jersey to become president.
Very briefly a governor. He started. He was the president of Princeton University for a long time, and he was only governor quite briefly.
Mm-hmm.
It's the way Glenn Beck played it was that he was introduced into politics by these bosses who were using him and saw him as an opportunity for themselves to get power. And in the movie, it shows how he really kind of double-crossed these people who gave him this power. It plays him to be this great hero, but it's really a quite an obvious propaganda piece. It was during World War II was when the film was released in 1944, near the end of the war. And, with, seeing the shadow of World War One being cast upon World War II, there is, certainly I believe it's in a way a pitch for the United Nations, because, since his failure of bringing the United States into the League of Nations, which really meant that the League of Nations was, even though it existed as an organization, it pretty much had no power or no clout, and it was really pitching, what a big, what a sad event that was. And I remember as a child hearing in history class, even in elementary school about this, and being on Wilson's side, identifying with this intellectual, identifying with this, what a great president he was, that, he had a PhD, and he was, it was, what a shame it was that he didn't accomplish, all these great visions they had. But growing up, I realized these visions were corrupt, and they.
Well, look, I would say, Yitzchak, I know you're getting off here on a soapbox against Wilson, but I would, in terms of why this film was made, I would assume that it wasn't just, a way to build patriotism. It was a way to sort of to draw a parallel between, America's role in World War I to World War II. Wilson did not enter the war when the war began. Some people thought it was actually an election ploy to send all these troops over, right? It was not, there was an element of Wilson's first term where he was somewhat of an isolationist that was going on in Europe. And it was only, I think it was political.
He was,
right. I think it was political advice was to then make an about face and really have a mass draft to send, millions of kids to fight. And at the time, it wasn't, the power of the presidency was so strong that I guess people didn't realize what was happening there. And there are those that blame what Wilson did to the outbreak of the Spanish flu. There are epidemiologists who have done their research that have determined that it might have started somewhere in Kansas, and then when it came to Europe from the troops that Wilson pushed out there, that's where the contagion began and was this greatest killer of the 20th century. So I don't know if you were aware of that, but that is one of the other terrible consequences of of fighting that great war, that Wilson began that incredible propaganda. I think that was part of it. Wilson and his team, were able to muzzle any voices against them, as you know. So he actually acted very much like almost in a dictatorial fashion during his second term. So, Wilson definitely needs to be reanalyzed for this time, but it seems like they were trying to draw a parallel to what FDR's policies were, to Wilson's policies, and that the victory of World War I was similar to the incipient victory they thought would happen in World War II, despite the great amount of American casualties that were obviously ripping the hearts out of so many people. But let's talk about the movie, Yitzchak. You're talking about the politics. Right. Again, you could have a film about a character that you don't like, but the film can be made well. Do you have anything to recommend the film? Alexander Knox, who plays Wilson, would you say he inhabits the role? He's a person. I mean, Wilson was not Mr. Charisma, right?
It really, I really believe he was Wilson. From what I know of Wilson, I felt he looked like him. He did a very good job there. I think. And for me, it was a delight. Some of the other actors who were in there, Vincent Price is there.
See, yeah,
Uh,
William
certainly,
McAdoo. Yes.
yeah.
Um,
And Eddie Foy Jr. plays his father, Eddie Foy, who we were talking about a movie with Eddie Foy Jr. recently, but with the Three Stooges, that maybe we'll talk about another time. But that was interesting. It was where Wilson was out seeing a show and managed to have, and that was who was in the show. Charles Colburn was in it very.
Right. Charles Colburn and Thomas Mitchell are two of the great character actors, really, of the golden age of Hollywood. And look, it's an all-star cast in many ways, right? Although it doesn't really have a superstar. I mean, Charles Colburn and Thomas Mitchell are two great. I mean, they could ham it up, and I could just watch those two guys, just hamming it up continuously. I mean, they are great in so many films, whether Stagecoach or the Lady Eve. There's a lot of great films that these two guys are in, and are they wasted? Do you feel that they make a good contribution? Sir Cedric Hardwicke, from was in that film as well. So
no, they all do a good job with the material they're handed. They were handed really material that was, I don't want to use the wrong terms, but it was I think it was overly, almost a Vaidazara, level of appreciation for Wilson, which we see these, the cults of personality that come up in politics, but it's.
I can tell you that today the film is pretty much ignored, but just like many films at the time. Obviously, Hollywood was knuckling under to this jingoist pressure because it was nominated for the Academy Award. It actually won. Lamar Trotti, who seemed to make a career out of writing these biopics. I know he wrote He was also the writer for Young Mr. Lincoln, John Ford's masterpiece, I think, about Abraham Lincoln. Which I would have advised you to watch instead. But Trotti did write the screenplay. It actually won for best cinematography that year as well. So it must.
Cinematography was beautiful, and it's beautiful Technicolor.
Right. It won the best art direction. It also was the best sound and best film editing.
And again, those were well deserved. It was a very beautifully made film. But just really, it's just so shameless of how, they at the beginning of the movie.
I don't get it though. So all these biopics from the 30s and 40s are shameless. None of them are meant to give the type of dark aspect that Scorsese's going to do for Jake LaMotta in Raging Bull, right? You're not going to get, or even Spike Lee did for Malcolm X. You aren't going to get, you go to a biopic. You go to a bio
as young Tom Edison and Spencer Tracy as Edison the Man, and these movies were also, and Edison was,
or Cagney as George M. Cohan, right?
Yeah.
I mean, basically the film is meant is meant to, all the biopics that I know. Again, the greatest ones: Gary Cooper in Sergeant York, Gary Cooper as Lou Gehrig in Pride of the Yankees. Yeah. I mean, these are all meant to display these people without their warts, right? It's meant to see them as heroes. And that's what Hollywood was looking for. They felt America was looking for people that were heroes. I just have a hard time seeing how you could relate, where's the dynamism in Woodrow Wilson to see him as a hero?
Yeah.
Gehrig had a quiet strength. He's going to, right? Wilson, I mean, it seems like, look, Spielberg, and again, we don't talk about recent films, but Spielberg, did a magic, he and Daniel Day-Lewis, in turning Lincoln into a real human being and not into a god. in the film Lincoln. So, I think it's tough to be able to do a biopic of a president, and for a 21st century critic, rabbi like you, to be satisfied with it, right? Especially if it's something from the 1940s, the way it is. But again, I'm just going to say that blood will out. The fact that I think it's been sort of left in the dust of Hollywood history shows that people do not really think it that culturally significant, and I don't think it's just because they're on Glenn Beck's side. There must be something.
I don't think so either, because he certainly has. Wilson certainly has his admirers to today. Like I said, my school teachers growing up, we were taught that he was really one of the greatest. That's what I remember as a very young child. I'm thinking third or fourth grade. The kind of pedestal that Wilson was put upon. I was certainly taught to respect him, and it was something that changed in my view of the world. When I got older.
Look, I'm always suspicious when the studios, in this sense, Fox, their tagline for the film was "Drama and spectacle unparalleled, entertainment undreamed of, 12,000 players, 200 mighty scenes."
The movie
okay.
2.5 hours long.
Okay. When you have to put a tagline in all capitals and tell your audience it's drama and spectacle, what was it? Because you had all the conventions, right? People going to World War I. Was the drama and spectacle that you were seeing?
There were a lot of conventions in this movie.
Undreamed of.
Yeah.
Well, Yitzchak,
it sounds like something else, like some of Vincent Price's later works, rather than
that's something you don't want to dream about. Yeah, it's undreamed of. Yeah. Look, So anyway, so it's definitely a curiosity, interesting to see. Alexander Knox, had a pretty decent career. I would love to see him and Edward G. Robinson in The Seawolf, where he plays Humphrey. He plays the bookish intellectual who ends up being lost at sea and being picked up by this aggressive. This is sort of like a Nietzsche book about Nietzsche, about the Superman, about what it takes to be a great human being. And I'd love to see that film, him and Edward G. Robinson, because that would be great to see him. Because listen, it must be something to be able to hold your own in front of all that hammy stuff. Well, let me talk about 1944, where I'm coming from. This is MGM's 1944 offering, and it was released in August 44. And again, World War II, Yitzchak, obviously, just like wasn't just what was happening overseas. It was clearly taking its toll on families who would send their children, who would send their husbands and wives sometimes, shortages. The whole country, in a way, was reeling. They had gone through the Depression, and now they were reeling from the years of war and wondering, were we on the right path? Would there be victory? Would the world be a better place? Had the world become unstable? And therefore, we think about pandemic, and we think about how difficult it's been for there to be mass-produced entertainment during, that centered on the pandemic era. People don't know, and I've seen critics talk about that they're not sure what sort of films can somehow deal with people where they are now, making mention. Or maybe they shouldn't. Maybe nobody should be masked. Maybe there should be no mention of it. Whereas it's interesting, World War II, it was clear from many of the films. I talked about The Clock a couple of weeks ago. Vincent Minnelli. The war was everywhere. It wasn't like we're existing outside of the reality. Hollywood today is struggling with that, trying to be able to give over verite, but that wasn't the case during World War II. And there were many, many films that respected the fact that things were going on in terms of spies, Nazis, fighting, and death. But it was a sanitized, different version of World War II, a World War II that Hollywood needed to project for people in order, and maybe it's because the government had their hand on the scale to push for certain messages. Maybe they were a push to make that film about Wilson in order to emphasize and sort of like, what FDR and Truman's policies. It's possible. Therefore, I think when anything that comes out during this period, you need to see it through the lens of World War II. And in 1944, the film that I want to recommend, not just talk about, is National Velvet. It was Clarence Brown's film. The characters are also the Browns, but the affinity to the material. It was a 1935 book that was written by, so obviously a Brit who was a British woman who wrote this book. She was in her mid-40s. It was a children's book illustrated by her 14-year-old daughter, and it was a bestseller. Now, the book itself told about a fictionally imagined story about a 14-year-old girl who, if you read the book, is anorexic. She's thin, she's not attractive, and she grows up in a house that she has support, but she is somewhat of a dysfunctional home. In the original book, her mother, it turns out, in England, had been an incredible female athlete, a very unique female athlete who had swum the English Channel. But because it was an area that women were not meant to excel or even be part of, although she had swum the channel, but the backlash of being a woman pushing herself into an area of, in Hebrew we say prosomet, an area where people would look at you, it caused a backlash for the mother. And the mother ended up, instead of keeping her swimmer's body in an athletic way, ended up just letting herself go to pot, getting married, having a bunch of children. And one of them, of course, is this Velvet, who in the book ends up, similar to the movie, is able to get a hold of this horse. A horse is left to her after the suicide of one of her friends in town. And she is able, with the help of a wandering fellow who turns out to be a horse trainer, she's able to train this horse and realize her dream of actually winning what at that time was called the Grand National, which was a steeplechase where the horses would have to jump over fences and jump over ravines and 30 dangerous, difficult jumps. So that was the story, and the story was popular, but it had a darker aspect to it. And academics who have analyzed this book have said that the source material, it's a proto-feminist tract. It also deals with a sense of what your body shape is and how you're determined. It deals with an unpopular 14-year-old girl who's recognizing her dreams and a mother who's frustrated. The movie changes all of that. And that is, of course, what movies always did. And instead, they cast, instead of a 14-year-old awkward anorexic, they cast, and this was the really beginning of the meteoric, incredible rise of Elizabeth Taylor. And Elizabeth Taylor gets this role. Supposedly, Liz and her mother had read the book, and they had read the book in England. Now, Elizabeth Taylor was actually born in England. And her parents, although American citizens, and Liz was as well, she grew up in England. Her father was an art dealer. Her mother, I think, was involved in some part of the theater world in England. But they obviously knew that they had a very precocious and beautiful child. Instead of a 14-year-old, Liz was only 12 when she took the role. And this film, of course, is famous, and she doesn't get even top billing, but she is clearly the star of the film. Top billing was given to Mickey Rooney. Now, again, and the film starts with Mickey Rooney walking down a Sylvan area, which is meant to be the Sussex area of England. But of course, in 1944, you could not film in England. In fact, many actors, including Cedric Hardwicke, who was in Wilson, were some of the actors who were able to escape as England was undergoing the terrors of World War II and the Blitz and other types of bombings. These people came to the United States, including the Taylors. The Taylors came in 1940 when they realized how terrible World War II was going to become. And that's where the dream of Elizabeth Taylor becoming a star began. And she was on this set with a number of other English actors. Arthur Treacher has a very cute role in this. But Mickey Rooney doesn't even try, Yitzchak, to adapt an English accent. In fact, I would like to say here that this film to me is sort of like the last hurrah of Mickey Rooney and the beginning of Elizabeth Taylor. Mickey Rooney had been in the 30s the most popular actor and the most highly paid. He was considered, he had been, of course, in silent films as well, but he really hit his stride being the star of the Andy Rooney serials and playing the all-American teenager. And remember, there was no television, there was no Ozzie and Harriet, but there was the Andy Rooney series. And America loved the Andy Rooney series, the Andy Hardy series. Andy Rooney, he's from 60 Minutes. Andy Hardy was Mickey Rooney. And he, of course, his father was the judge, and he was a typical teenager. And America loved it during the Depression. And even as the drumbeats of World War II began, this was stability, this was family, this was a little bit of hijinks with him being taught at the end the lessons he needed to be taught. He was able to embody every American kid. And despite his short stature, and despite other aspects of him that you could find him clownish, he actually was able to capture the hearts of so many American film goers to be the number one box office star of the late 1930s. However, as he aged, he's born in 1920. He couldn't play the kid anymore. He couldn't play, the bad boy.
When he came on The Simpsons, he said, I was the top box office star in 1939 and 1940. So then they were like, wow, spanning 2 decades.
He made it into night. But the problem was he could be a Bart. He could be, but as he got older.
And like I said, he was young Tom Edison also.
Right. So there was an attempt, Yitzchak, to push him into adult roles. Young Tom Edison, The Human Comedy, which Clarence Brown made as well. Even afterwards, World War II, he played in the biopic of Lawrence Hart. You've heard of Rodgers and Hart, right? Words and Music. There was a biopic. You've heard of Rodgers and Hammerstein, of course, right? Yes, say if you've heard of Rodgers and Hammerstein. Okay. You haven't. All right. Rodgers and Hammerstein are just the most successful lyricist and songwriting team, right? Okay. So Rodgers and before Hammerstein got involved, there was Hart, Lorenz Hart, who died young. Mickey Rooney played Lorenz Hart. However, all of those films were really flops. I mean, they're interesting, but basically he couldn't carry a film like the way he could when he was a kid. When he was a kid, he could in Boys Town, he could get top billing over Spencer Tracy. And that's how great his star potential was and what he was able, but it flittered away. And in 1944, he was actually supposed to report to overseas. And he actually won the Bronze Star in World War II for putting on shows and going into combat zones and entertaining the troops with his singing, with his dancing, with his comedy, because, he had been involved, he'd been in silent films. He was a very, very talented person. But as a movie star, this was really his decline. And this film, I think, when I see the film opening with him walking over the opening credits, this is Mickey Rooney's last hurrah, so to speak. Again, he plays a character who is sort of rootless. It's clear that he's been estranged from his father. The audience knows that the father had been a trainer as well, a trainer for swimming. The father had actually coincidentally been the trainer of Velvet's mother. And therefore, Mickey, as he's called, discovers the name of the Browns and the city they live in this town, Sewell's. And he goes to find them, seemingly to blackmail them, right? He's seemingly coming there to either rob them or blackmail them, to insinuate to the mother that I know you might have had an affair with my father. That, again, the film doesn't put it straight out there, but it pussyfoots around that idea. And however, he ends up meeting what was supposed to be 1920s England version of of Andy Hardy and Judge Hardy's house. The film is really about, it's called one of the best sports films of all time, but it's really about the centrality of family and the struggle of keeping a family together during difficult times and understanding where you need to grow and change and accept difficulty and disappointment and even possibly death. That is really the theme of the film. And it's articulated not by some overweight, out of it mother, but by Anne Revere, a descendant, I think she was a direct descendant of Paul Revere, who won the Academy Award playing the mother. Again, without even the stitch of an English accent. I don't think she even tried. And she is, and remember what Hollywood wanted to do here. London was, in a way, a suburb of the United States. The English, they weren't considered the stuffy cousins who we couldn't stand anymore. The approach was that England was us. Films like Mrs. Miniver and others stressed to American audiences that these are the ones who are suffering more than we are. They are the first responders. They're the ones that are fighting together with us, hand in hand, against the Nazi terror, against fascism. So therefore, the idea of an English family being like an American family made sense. So to have a Mickey Rooney become sort of an adoptive son in that family, and to have an Anne Revere playing the mother without the hint of an accent makes a lot of sense. And here she was giving out incredible homespun wisdom about letting children grow up. She wasn't some sort of doddering Beulah Bondi or Zazu Pitts type of mother that you sometimes find, or some sort of a screwball comedy mother who doesn't know what's going on. In fact, to me, the film is anachronistic, and that the mother is almost like she's an oracle. She's almost like the spirit of prophecy in this film. And everything she says is, in your time, evil is necessary because that's how good comes out. You have to realize sometimes that you always have to move on. It isn't wrong to want to have glory. It isn't wrong to have a folly. There's no saying grace. There's no priest who comes and gives any bracha or any blessing. This is really about a sort of almost a coming to terms with the last couple of years of the war, but doing it in 1920s England. And I think that's why they awarded Anne Revere the Academy Award. She seemed to be saying the important things that need to be said. Now, it's done in a good acting style. Throughout most of the film, she speaks to Donald Crisp, who's her husband, as if, what do you say, Mr. Brown? And what do you say, Mrs. Brown? It's only the very last 2 minutes of the film that you realize what their first names are. But there's clearly a love between them. There's an understanding. These are great parents. So this really gives a sense to American audience that the ones over there are just like us, and the values that we fought for England, and the people who died at Normandy Beach for the sake of those Europeans were for a value that was very similar to what it's like to be just a standard American kid. And that's sort of what you see in the film. And again, now the main part of the action that most people know. Liz and the horse, Velvet and the horse. Okay. I'm going to go and as a critic here, I'm going to say that the last 20 minutes are spectacular. It is as exciting as the chariot race in Ben-Hur, and it really is great. Now, America loved horse racing. Horse racing, along with professional boxing, college football, and baseball. I don't know which one, Yitzchak, got more people's attention. Seabiscuit was as big of a hero as Babe Ruth was, as you know. And Seabiscuit, of course, was people. Everybody knew about Pimlico, about the Kentucky Derby. So the fact that a horse race was the center of the story was not a curiosity. The ponies were something that people loved, and therefore that scene of the horse race, of how difficult it was, and how eventually Velvet wins the race, is a very well done, and it's definitely your heart can be in your throat watching it. However, the horse and Elizabeth Taylor really, you don't really get that. We talked about the sense of bonding with the animal. Liz is always talking. The little girl is always talking about how she loves the horse. She talks to the horse. The horse can do anything. But clearly you can see from the film that it represents I can do anything. And yet, because she can't strut and say, I'm great, she projects this on the horse. But it's not like you have such great scenes with the horse. She does ride it. The horse, you can see the horse running, but it's not like Lassie, which was a film she made a couple years before that with Roddy McDowall, and she had a small part in Lassie Come Home. Again, with dogs, you get a lot better acting. There is, by the way, a little mutt in this. I don't know what breed it was, but there is a dog in this this house in England who steals a lot of scenes as well, and you can see how the family loves feeding the dog and giving it scraps, and the dog is in the top of everything. And it's not Brown, the director, and the animal trainers did a great job, because in many of the movies that have dogs, you can tell that the dog is looking at the trainer. Here, the dog really seems to be involved with the family totally and completely. So whatever dog they got, this dog could have gone along with Asta, which is, of course, the dog in the two original Thin Man films with William Powell and Myrna Loy, which is some of the greatest dog actors, along with Rin Tin Tin and Lassie. But this dog, Jacob, does a great job. But it was more Elizabeth Taylor being able to show you that I can, as a 12-year-old girl, to show passion, to actually say the lines like an English girl. And that was one of the reasons she got the role, because she was able to speak with a real English accent. And she had familiarity in riding a horse. She was trained to ride a horse more. Obviously, there must have been some stunt doubles in some of the scenes. There is again, I think Elizabeth Taylor in her biography talked about the fact that during one of the key scenes in this film, she fell off the horse and she injured her back. And it was from there that she began a lifelong, from the age of 12, a lifelong addiction to painkillers, which really, in a way, really changed the course of her life. But in this film, she was, in a way, such a and she wasn't like a Jodie Foster or Brooke Shields in the 70s, being overly sensual. She was clearly just a 12-year-old pretty girl wearing a retainer in her mouth, but she was able to convey sincerity. Her lines, as I said, she was a pro. She knocked it out of the park, and you can see the movie star that she was becoming. There's a lot of, and again, you really, if you look at that film, you can see where she decides to become the jockey, and Mickey takes her into the jockey room, and and all the jockeys are taking their shirts off and getting dressed. There's a little bit of humor there, and it's really played very well. The film is a great family movie. You don't have to overanalyze it the way I am to watch it with your kids. During this program, the Projectionist as Semicha, we could probably go through many of these programs and say it's for a more mature yeshiva guy. I would say this film, I would say you could bring your kids, the Kolakowski kids, the Kivlevitz grandchildren, perhaps, and really enjoy the film. Just like I said, the family interaction. There's enough of the horse and the dog to make it worthwhile. I should also just mention as I close here that a number of English refugees. One of them, I think I have to mention, she plays Velvet's oldest sister, Edwina, played by Angela Lansbury. Angela Lansbury also escapes England. She is 7 years older than Elizabeth Taylor, and she plays in this film the older sister who's already interested in boys, wearing makeup. Of course, once again, the mother, says, no, it's okay. She can lie. She can go out with boys. That's what it's meant for. We're not going to come down hard. Again, this sort of hands-off mothering that she was supposedly representative of. But it's great to see Angela Lansbury in this film. It's funny because, of course, a year before this film, she was in the remake of Gaslight with Charles Boyer and Ingrid Bergman, and she plays the very devious maid. In fact, for years, Angela Lansbury played heavy parts. She was actually, meaning she was sort of evil in many of her films that she made throughout the 40s and 50s. She's still alive, of course, Angela. She's about 97 years old, I think. I think she was born in 1925, so she's about 96 now. And she played, again, it's interesting that unlike Liz Taylor, also her fellow refugee, Liz became just a star that you had to bow down in front of, like a comet, like a Cary, like we talked about Cary Grant and Andrea Hepburn. That's the way Elizabeth Taylor was. She was just so stunning that she dominated. Angela Lansbury had to earn her chops. She didn't have that type of it, but it is interesting to see her here playing sort of like this older girl who's experimenting with boys, and watching her here together with Elizabeth Taylor, I think it's an interesting treat for me when I think about Angela Lansbury, the arc of her career. She definitely is longevity. Unlike Liz and Mickey Rooney, who went through, I think, together between them 20 marriages. I think Mickey Rooney was married 9 times, and Elizabeth Taylor might have been married 7 or 10 times as well, I guess. Angela Lansbury, the small contract players who had their roles, I think they lived a more stable life. Mickey Rooney, the ups and downs. He was, if you remember, Yitzchak, you might remember that he sued people around him for elder abuse. He was not a happy person, despite the fact that he worked so hard at his comedy and making people happy, and really accepting his old age. And of course, Elizabeth Taylor, we know. I do want to be masker her though, Latov, that she, especially after she married Mike Todd, she found herself, she stated her great affinity to the Jewish people, and she believed herself a Jewish woman. Mike Todd was a Avraham Gershon Grunbaum, but he was one of the most successful producers in Hollywood. He produced, of course, the Around the World in 80 Days. And I don't think she ever recovered really from, from his, from the tragedy of his dying in that plane crash. But she, when in the late 50s, early 60s, she gave millions of dollars to the UJF. I think I've mentioned this before to you, how the Arab countries banned her films because they saw her as a Jew and saw her as someone who was a supporter of Israel. So, I think we have to be masker her Latov. I think she was she might not have had a burial but she did have a tahara, and she did have there was to me a little bit of a Kiddush Hashem, because they did not wait for all the dignitaries to come, because there was some rabbi that was involved in her funeral that said we have to bury her as soon as possible after when she died. I think it was in 2011. So
yeah, her conversion, she said it wasn't for her Jewish husband. She always wanted to be Jewish for a long time before meeting them. So it wasn't for marriage.
Well, again, it's interesting. Again, how she was such a beautiful person. I think I really think it holds up. I mean, I don't think England ever was like that, and but still, it's able to, I believe, hold your interest, and a slice of Americana or Anglo Americana that I think is worth watching. And I think the fact that it's unlike Wilson, and I hate really contrasting our two picks here, but I think those films in 1944, they both a heady amount of nominations, but I think National Velvet is a film that can still ring a lot of bells, and I think it's a fascinating view of what Hollywood needed to do for audiences that were going through a crisis period. What sort of entertainment and what sort of, I wouldn't call it subliminal messages, what sort of messages people were responding to. And maybe the messages of Wilson, Yitzchak, maybe were extremely expensive to make in those days. And they were just, a Technicolor film was a tremendous treat, as you know. It was sort of like, oh, this is going to be something. So I think these two can really stand as a very interesting contrast to each other. Well, that's about it, my friends. Watch your step on the way out. We'll catch you hopefully next week. Be well. Thanks for joining us for another episode from the Yeshiva of Newark at IDT Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you don't miss a single episode.